All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our last session, amazing, of our 2021 Rescuing History Conference. And I know a lot of you have heard me say this already, but since we do have plenty of new people on for this afternoon session, I just want to introduce myself again, remind you that I'm Mary Bergman. I'm the Executive Director of the Nantucket Preservation Trust, and the Nantucket Preservation Trust is putting on this conference, our third conference about historic preservation and coastal resiliency, climate change, sustainability, and we are so grateful for the support of the Community Foundation for Nantucket's Remain Nantucket Fund and for the support of all of our leadership supporters who made this program happen. And you can read more about all of those sponsors and supporters at nantucketpreservation.org. We're also so thankful to all of the speakers who've been with us throughout the last 2 days, and to all of you who stayed on throughout this beautiful sunny September day as we've learned so many different things about deconstruction, demolition, just what happens to a building once it reaches the end of its life cycle, how to make a building more resilient, more energy efficient, an older building more energy efficient, just when and where do solar panels work out in the local historic district. We had, I think, a really inspiring talk just before this with a few homeowners who put solar panels on their properties in one right downtown, right on Main Street, on Upper Main Street, and to learn just how those technologies can be integrated into older structures and still preserve that look, that unique Nantucketness that's so hard to put into words, as I am failing to do now, while still planning for the future. So our last panel, I'm so excited to have you folks here from the Envision Resilience Challenge teams. And I think it's great to end on we've gotten into some real nitty gritty, looking at, individual homes, looking at roof planes and things like that, and to kind of go back out a little bit and to take a larger view. So I'm going to introduce you to Cecil, Barron, Jensen first, and Cecil will then introduce you to our next panelists. And so here we go. Cecil became the Executive Director of Remain Nantucket and Remain Ventures in 2018. And in addition to her experience in leading dynamic organizations to achieve strategic goals, Cecil has a deep understanding of how cultural organizations contribute to the viability of downtown Nantucket and the enthusiasm to drive Remain Nantucket's vision forward into the future, tackling issues such as transportation, economic stability, and environmental resource management. Past board member of several Nantucket nonprofits, Cecil was recently appointed as a member of the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and she has a BA from Middlebury College in Vermont. So please join me in welcoming Cecil.
So glad you mentioned my alma mater. Thank you. Go Mid. Okay, so thank you so much for having me here today. As Mary said, I'm Cecil Barron Jensen, and I have the distinct pleasure of being the Executive Director of Remain Nantucket and Remain Ventures. And I am delighted to be part of this wonderful conference focusing on green energy, resilience, and the preservation of places we hold most dear. And that honestly sounds exactly like the mission of Remain Nantucket. So thank you, Mary, for allowing us to be part of this, and congrats to everybody at the Nantucket Preservation Trust. As the sponsor and organizer of Envision Resilience Nantucket Challenge, Remain is pleased to be part of the island's conversation about the future of Nantucket in the face of climate change and sea level rise. For those of you who haven't already heard about Envision Resilience Nantucket Challenge, it has been a year-long project that asked graduate and undergraduate students from 5 of the leading university programs to imagine Nantucket's waterfront with as much as 9 more feet of water by the year 2100. Their well-researched and thought-provoking designs form the centerpiece of an expanded community engagement campaign, which includes presentations, a speaker series, coffee roundtables, possible public art display, which I'm not going to say too much about, a community survey measuring attitudes on climate change. And we are really, really, truly proud of to be hosting an exhibition of the students' work down at the Macy Warehouse on Strait Wharf through the end of the year. While the students' work is all of it is innovative, and I want you to all go and see all of their work because it is certainly worth the trip. We're delighted today to have a couple of the students who are going to tell us about some of their individual work. So that's exciting, but please go down and see the whole of the exhibition. Like the Preservation Trust and our fellow speakers, Remain firmly believes that knowledge is power. For that reason, our website, www.envisionresilience.org, is a wonderful resource for everyone to access. We recently heard from a gentleman who said that after visiting the exhibition, he dove straight into the website's collection of lectures that we had hosted this winter for our students. And he was loving it, absolutely loving it. But he emailed us to say that he'd be expecting his diploma upon graduation. Which is actually how we all felt going through this process. We all learned so much, and that information is still available for everybody to go and visit on our website. And while the challenge was focused on Nantucket, it was also designed to inspire other coastal communities and is intended to be a demonstration exercise for how all coastal communities can live innovatively with water. And by the way, we're hoping to take Envision Resilience to one more location next spring. And then after that, we're hoping other communities will pick it up and carry it forward. Nothing would make us happier than to have Envision Resilience studies in multiple coastal communities in the future. So as I said, we're extraordinarily proud of our faculty and their students and deeply impressed by all of their designs. They are optimistic, practical, and beautiful suggested solutions to the mounting problem of sea level rise. And indeed, they are inspiring. And as Wendy Schmidt, Remain Nantucket's founder, has said, you have to imagine something before you can begin to work toward it. Today, I am so pleased to introduce you to some of our faculty and their students. So let's start with Sara Jensen Carr from Northeastern University, with her students, Alex Renaud and Evan Bradley.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much, Cecil, and thanks to Alex and Evan for taking some time out of their day today to present their projects. I'm so happy they get another chance to share it with a wider audience. Can everybody see my screen? Yep, the full screen? Okay, great. Okay, so we've titled this Transitional Ecologies, New Public Infrastructures for Nantucket. And before I talk a little bit about our approach to the challenge, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the context at Northeastern University. We actually had students from 4 different programs in the studio. So we had some, students from environmental engineering and landscape architecture, landscape architecture and environmental science. And also we run an interdisciplinary program, a Master of Design in Sustainable Urban Environments. And so students from all those programs were working together on this. And I think, sort of our largest challenge with this class was thinking about the timescales of climate change and resilience and trying to condense it into, these images that you'll see here today. And I'm mostly going to share, some of the products from the class. And so we started by thinking about how do we map time, basically, how do we represent it, both in terms of the movement of oceans, but also the history of industry on Nantucket as well. We had other students that were looking at ecological history as well and looking what can we know from the histories of soil and doing this all remotely. So basically that was the first challenge, is how do we get this picture of the island from where we were in Boston. And actually we had students all over So beyond looking at this, we were also trying to understand, this very sort of like upper level, higher level look at the island, but also the very dimensions of, say, how does boat parking and circulation work, right? And how would that affect our designs in the end? Employing Google Street View, as you can see here with Bobbia's picture here, where she was looking at a street and saying, oh, here's an example of water clogging, right? So maybe this is a place where we need to intervene. And so looking at the island from all scales in terms of both time and also physical scale. And then before we actually launched into the final projects, we actually did one more sort of experimental thing, again, working remotely. I come from a public health and design background, and there's a method in public health called photo voice, where you simply ask residents to just please photograph your everyday environments, right? And where do you go? Where do you go over the course of the week? And how do you see climate change around you? And so the students were paired with a community member. Thank you very much to Cecil and Claire for matching us up with them. We asked residents to just take pictures of their environments over a week. And what was interesting is, then the students interviewed these residents and they transcribed the interviews. And some of this is up at the Macy warehouse as well. We've actually made it into a larger map along with these quotes. And this idea of sort of impending climate change all around us at a very intimate level became very clear in the interviews as well. I ended up calling this presentation Transitional Ecologies, and that was actually a theme that came out of the student work. Here you can see Kay Ping Kuo's work on Brent Point, where she's envisioning a very multifaceted structure that would build up over time with these piers that would not only protect the island, but also make sort of a robust aquaculture place where people could go. And in our class, the students were tasked with they had to intervene in some sort of public infrastructure in Nantucket. So they could rethink roads, they could rethink the shoreline, they could rethink public plazas. And you'll see a little bit about that in the two student projects that we're going to highlight today. But quickly, it ranged from Kay Ping's proposal for the aquaculture hub to Cassandra Lanson's proposal here to actually turn a large part of the Washington Street area into a bird habitat. So really, what would happen if we give some of this back to the wildlife? And you can see some of her proposals here. And then, we also encourage the students to think about, okay, how would this actually work, again, on this intimate level? So Cassandra came up with, like, what can residents on Nantucket do to support a bird habitat? Whereas Kay Ping was thinking about the sort of marketing material, like how would people go to the Aqua Island? Because I think at Northeastern, we really try and push this idea that physical resilience is also social resilience, right? Physical resilience does not persist without this community input. But for now, I wanted to turn it over to two of my students, Alex Renaud and Evan Bradley, to talk a little bit about their projects. So Alex and Evan, I'm going to bring your projects up and just tell me when you want to advance the next slide when you're ready.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction, and happy to be here to talk about my project a little bit. So essentially what I was really focusing on was the Brent Point area. And this here is kind of just like the cover for my own project. And you may have seen it earlier in this presentation talking about the photo voice interviews that we were actually able to do. And this actually was a big, for me, a point of inspiration, thinking about how this house, I think, is over on the western side of the island in Nantucket, and thinking about how this house had to be kept moving back due to this rising sea level here, and then eventually it was torn down. And thinking about how the dynamic forces of the movement of sediment here, and also just the sea level itself is causing so much population change was really striking, at least for me. Next slide. And so we kind of started our semester, Professor Carr kind of charged us to think about how this area is impacted and how vulnerable is it to these dynamic forces at play. So with me focusing on the Brent Point area, I tried to look at some things that I felt important that were big indicators of resilience, at least in terms of, again, sea level rise. So I took a look at impervious surfaces here, which you can see in black, and thinking about how that intersects with the elevation. If you know the Brent Point area, you know that's a very low-lying neighborhood, and it makes it very vulnerable. And thinking about how that then combines with categories of hurricane flooding. Next slide. And then I kind of took a more temporal look at this and tried to imagine how flooding events actually came about throughout the past 40 years, and thinking about how they're spread out over time versus in the years and also within the months, and thinking about how sea level rise in general is then projected for the future. And so for me, these two kind of exercises are more foundational towards how I wanted to approach imagining a new Brent Point and a new neighborhood there. Next slide. And so this is kind of what I came up to in terms of a larger site plan for the neighborhood. I had a big goal of trying to incorporate the three strategies that Sara was talking about earlier, and trying to employ them at all different scales, whether it be individual homeowners, whether it be a whole neighborhood approach, or whether it be something in between. So if you want to go next slide. I have three high-level strategies that I really tried to employ with this site plan. The first being a restoration of the existing tidal marsh that's now been very much shrunken down due to road development and also just the large housing development that we have within the Brent Point neighborhood. So thinking about a way that this tidal marsh can be restored in a way that can boost ecosystem productivity and have a way for water to flow within this area as sea level does rise. Secondly, trying to imagine a way in which the shoreline itself could be expanded. There's a long skinny beach currently along the Brent Point neighborhood, and thinking about a way that perhaps this could be extended to dissipate wave energy and also have more space for people to enjoy this neighborhood as a public space. And lastly, thinking about a new mobility for the neighborhood. I have somewhat of a transportation background, so trying to think about how the streets on the neighborhood itself could be used as ways to convey people in different ways, but then also ways to convey resources, particularly water. I think we a lot of times can hold a traditional view on how we design our streets, and I think that they can really be agents of good change for this neighborhood. Next slide. And so in terms of thinking about that infrastructure approach to roads, this is just a quick temporal look at how that might look in terms of changing road networks through time. And so kind of the main facets that you can see here are the development of the tidal marsh and kind of seeing how that may grow over time through various road closures. And then also thinking about how some streets may be limited to traffic in ways that can improve active transportation for people that need to walk or bike throughout the neighborhood, and also thinking about ways that water can be conveyed through those streets. Next slide. And next, I want to kind of take a look at this northwestern side here that you can kind of see a dotted line around. This is kind of a main focus area for this idea of restoring the tidal marsh that is within the island on this neighborhood. Currently, there are two roads kind of like dissecting this marsh area into smaller quadrants. And so kind of thinking about a way to reimagine it is kind of what I want to talk about next on the next slide. And so this is kind of just a perspective of that area. And I really tried to convey through this idea of how water could really come in and actually be absorbed through this own wetland and have a way to convey across throughout the neighborhood here while also preserving the existing homes. And also trying to think about preserving existing assets within the community. I think that there's a really lively restaurant on the corner here, and also beach access on the northwest side. And so kind of thinking about ways to preserve roads that need to be there while also having a reconnection of people to this like public space that used to be here and is still here, just in a more limited way. So this drawing here kind of features raised boardwalks, road overpass, and many different strategies to employ to kind of restore this tidal marsh to what it could be. Next slide. And lastly, I did want to take a look at Herbert Avenue to kind of describe to you in a different way how that could kind of look and how residents themselves can kind of be agents of change within the neighborhood. So these next two drawings are kind of focused within that perspective on Herbert Ave, which, if you're not familiar with the Brent Point neighborhood, is along the shoreline on the northeast side of the neighborhood. This first is just a quick section to think about how Herbert Ave and the shoreline can be reimagined. So kind of you have an existing and a reimagined on the bottom. And Herbert Ave itself, was kind of thinking about how maybe it's limited to one way of traffic and the other lane could actually be turned into an active boardwalk where people can be conveyed in terms of bicycle and pedestrian usage, and then also water can be conveyed to then connect to the restored tidal marsh that I was explaining about earlier, and also thinking about how residents may elect to think about how they can redesign their homes in resilient ways. This just gives one example here of elevating a house and turning one's own front lawn into a retention basin to hold water and kind of create additional storage for this water that's going to be flowing through at some point. Next slide. And also within the same lens, this is just a perspective of the same area, kind of thinking about how perhaps a resident may decide to transform part of their lawn into native plantings as a way to dissipate wave energy and absorb some of the water coming in, while also kind of preserving their backyard for that traditional recreational space that everyone on the island loves to have. So trying to think about different ideas for residents to be able to take part in this effort, while also kind of preserving ways of life that they seem important, I think is going to be like a key part towards like designing for a more resilient and sustainable future. And I believe that wraps up my section. Sorry for going a little over,
Okay.
but
Thanks.
going to pass it on to Evan.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much, Alex. And I just wanted to point out it was a great honor too that Alex's last image here was actually chosen for the State of the Coast report, which I think speaks to the reach of the program and of course the excellent work that the students did as well. But with that, I wanted to introduce Evan Bradley, who's going to talk about his proposal, which is actually for the downtown portion of Nantucket.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, my project Nantucket Common focuses on the town area as identified by Envision Resilience Nantucket. And so next slide, please. I began my analysis similarly to Alex by identifying common conditions and patterns of storm surge flooding that have occurred in Nantucket over the years, dating all the way back to 1635. I have a focus on more recent dates as that's when actual tidal gauge data exists. But I took a look at certain factors, including the path of the storms in question, wind direction affecting Nantucket at the time, as well as the moon phase, which has an impact on tides, to identify if there were certain conditions that happen to affect Nantucket more harshly during certain storms in terms of storm surge, and also to identify certain areas that were more vulnerable to flooding than other areas. So if you go to the next slide, Sarah, you'll see I noticed that up to 4 feet of storm surge above the mean water level, certain areas would be affected, but above 5 feet, you really start to see that it doesn't quite matter, that there is just broad impacts across Brent Point in the town in terms of flooding. And so this demands a sort of different response, especially as sea level starts to approach just that 4 or 5 foot level mark on its own. What do we do? And so I started thinking about a toolbox of responses. Next slide, Sarah, please. Started thinking about a toolbox of responses that Nantucket could consider implementing, in the future. I was guided both by the historic context of the downtown area. I grew up in a similar port city filled with brick and cobblestone and quaintness. And it's important to me to keep that context. I was also inspired by the context of the Emerald Necklace here in Boston, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, as well as projects like that are currently underway, like the Big U plan to encircle Lower Manhattan. So these are some of the more natural features in this toolbox. And if Sarah moves to the next slide, one idea I thought that could really work within Nantucket's context is a boardwalk that is able, essentially, in storm events to tilt up and to become a barrier, serving multiple purposes. I was inspired by an idea from the Big U about how do you make a wall more than a wall? How do you make a barrier more than a barrier? It's not attractive nor fun to have this big wall on your coastline, especially when you have such a beautiful coastline to admire. And so I want something that can serve, both the needs of people when there is a storm and when there is not. So next slide, please, Sarah. And so this toolbox of interventions, this is how I ended up sort of arranging them throughout the town area and a bit beyond. Extending current marine uses further out into the harbor and adjusting the current shoreline of the town area from, a very hard-edged, stony, rocky sort of shoreline with walls and cofferdams and what have you, to something that's more marshy and softer and greener and gentler and is able to absorb stormwater. Further inland, looking at a connected series of parks and berms and green structures, green infrastructure that can serve as a physical barrier or elevate certain low areas vulnerable to flooding and render them less vulnerable to flooding over time. And then a combination of underground infrastructure, conduits to hold water, and some sort of building interventions as well. And my thought behind all this is that similarly to the interventions I designed, it's a toolbox for Nantucket. These interventions can operate independently and interdependently and can be phased in over time. Next slide, please, Sarah. So this is not super visible. I'm just going to go through this quickly, but to give an idea of myself, an idea of how flooding would impact the area over time, I identified current conditions, present day conditions with a certain amount of storm flooding, and flooding conditions with a certain amount of sea level rise. And so, 2070, if the ocean rises 5 feet, you have, vulnerable buildings, and buildings are going to get impacted pretty hard. My goal is to prevent that. So next slide, please, Sarah. And so this should be a bit more visible here. So I have my sort of built out conditions here with these softer, marshier shorelines. My goal is that in 2070, with a 3-foot sea level rise estimated, that Nantucket, the town area, won't really notice the difference at all. If you go to 2070 and have a 5-foot storm tide on top of this 3-foot, this is sort of lower level sea level rise, then certain buildings that are already out on the coastline and you probably know to be vulnerable or can have interventions used to help mitigate flooding, there's not going to be substantial impacts. And then further out, let's say to 2100, when we know that there's going to be a lot more sea level rise, you can use this boardwalk barrier concept as a hard barrier. Or for like these really big storms where there is a large amount of storm surge flooding, you can implement the boardwalk barrier in this instance and then depend on these less deployable situations in lesser storms or sunny day flooding. Next slide, please, Sarah. So this is an overview. My thought is focused on the area around the Stop and Shop parking lot and the gas tanks just south of the main section of downtown. Just looking at the map and from my research around the area, I noticed that downtown Nantucket really lacks or appears to lack a central gathering place and a central green space. And so my goal was to provide those spaces for this area. And so my thought is both a sunken plaza similar to like Dutch water plazas that can absorb flooding at certain high impact events, as well as a more elevated green space that can divert incoming floodwaters into this lower area. So if Sarah goes to the next slide, this is this sort of major coastal flood in 2070 where there's less sea level rise, or a minor flood in 2100. Water gets directed into the space, this sunken space, and disperses slowly over time. Next slide. This is when there's a major storm coming, and this is the deployment of the boardwalk question. So a toolbox for Nantucket, hopefully, and one I feel pretty good about. So thank you for your time, and thanks, Sarah.
Great. Thank you both. So just to close, I just wanted to again thank Remain Nantucket for putting on a really great event. This is a joyful time in the beginning of the summer when we were all freshly vaccinated and seeing each other in person at the same time, and just a great event at the Great Herbert Yacht Club, and something, you know, we can never replicate in the remote classroom is just getting out and talking to community members and presenting ideas just like we are today. So I wanted to thank everybody. Thank you for having us today, and close with these delightful postcards that Evan and Mia in our class made that were handed out at the event that that picture this more resilient Nantucket. So thank you very much. And I guess I'll throw it over to Chris.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say welcome to Chris Reed. He's with the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and his students Yvonne Fang and Caleb Nash. Welcome, and thanks for sharing your work with us today.
Great, thanks, Cecil. Great to see you. Thanks to you and to Mary to having us all today. This is a wonderful event. Great opportunity to share some of our work with you. Also want to thank Cecil and the Remain team. I mean, they were so amazing throughout the whole process, providing information, coordinating us all, and just being really great hosts. So thanks to all of you. None of this would have been possible without that great Remain team. At Harvard, we are graduate students working landscape architects, and urban designers. Our take on the studio, titled Away Ashore Adrift, it's a bit of a nod to Herman Melville, a nod to Nathaniel Philbrick, but also this idea of being adrift or being, engaged in the environmental dynamics that surround us. We took a really broad view on the work, stepping back from the immediacy of the problem. We looked at literature like Graham Swift's Waterland, a really beautiful piece that reminds us that waters rise, they recede, they're always returning. Reminds us of the inevitability of the water in the sense that no matter what we do to counter its effects, it's always beyond our full control. And so how this raised questions of how we design with nature, with dynamics, and how do we allow for water in the environment to kind of do what it needs to do, all the while accommodating us as humans and the various ecosystems around us in that world. And so students really looked at some broad research exercises. They looked at geological formation. They looked at the unique characteristics of water on the island, the idea of warm and cool currents colliding to produce the fog that's so characteristic of the island. Looking at erosional and depositional environments, looking at surface water, coastal water, and also groundwater resources. This is all implicated by the environmental challenges that we face ahead. They also look more specifically at the inner harbor, at the effects both of sea level rise and the increased nutrient loads that are coming off of many of the properties around the harbor, having a negative impact on eelgrass habitat, shellfish habitat, and therefore on the economy of the island and the number of laborers that are involved in shellfishing here. So really making a connection between environment, people, labor, and economy, I think is one of the things that the students were able to unlock. We also looked really quite broadly at the multiple populations of people, not just who is here presently, but the generations of people who have inhabited the island for many, many years, starting with indigenous populations, the Wampanoag tribe, who very cleverly moved seasonally from the shore during the summer where they could gather fruits of the sea, inland, where they would be protected from some of the gale force winds and weather conditions in the winter. So really having a different understand of land and settlement and occupation. Students looked at various histories, recognizing that the island was a refuge for African Americans, former enslaved people, coming to the island and actually rising through the ranks of the whaling industry to lead leadership positions and captainships on whaleboat, and really extending that understanding to the idea today that there are multiple populations on people. Certainly there's a great residential community, many people who come to the island as a tourist destination, but also many people who are a part of the very rich and robust service economy here that we need to account for. And so really taking on this kind of social and anthropological perspective, I think, was part of the early research as well. And then we even looked at things like property ownership, so looking at both public and private, and this disconnect between a very evolving, dynamic, and shifting landscape. This is on the cliff side where we have a lot of erosion, and the static idea that we have of property and private property rights, and how we can begin to think through some of those issues as well. And so we took this expansive view. We looked at even issues of food and food independence, how we might begin to think about education, labor, et cetera, and begin to design with a sense of dynamic in hand. We had 5 different groups, 5 pairs looking at different places around the island. One group really looked at the Central Harbor front. They took on 3 different sites. First at Children's Beach, second along Washington Street, third at Goose Pond. And they began to imagine more adaptive landscapes in each of those places, landscapes that would allow for water, for sea level rise, for new habitat development, new wetland development, as well as new public access opportunities. So not just looking at sea level rise as a challenge, but really as an opportunity to rethink major pieces of the Nantucket waterfront, all the while thinking about both public access and ecological diversity as goals. A second group that looked at Brent Point, very much like Alex, but in some ways thinking about a more radical reformation or redelineation of this place. Brent Point is really important for the protection it gives to the inner harbor. And so this student group really wanted to kind of mix that up again, provide new opportunities for public access, and really reconfigure within the islands, if you will, reforms of buffering, if you will, creating islands of habitat and islands for relocation or rebuilding of some of the private residences as well. So a project that's really about reincorporating some of the private residential infrastructure that's there, but providing new recreational habitat infrastructure and protective infrastructure in a much reformulated environment, if you will. And then a third project, a much quieter project. This team was looking at Coteau Point and the barrier beach there, realizing the important role that plays is protecting the inner harbor. And so they were using a series of light infrastructure. Think of these as dune fences, oyster domes under the water, things that could more rapidly accumulate sediments being deposited by wind and by waves to continuously build up the barrier beach so that there would always be protection to that inner harbor. But in doing so, also building up new habitat areas and new public access areas for people to engage in this environment. So a range of light touch, heavier touch, incremental interventions here. I'm going to hand it over to Yvonne first, and then Caleb. Yvonne with Cultivation Chronicles, really drawing on her own anthropological training. Yvonne, take it from here.
Hello, my name is Yvonne, and I'll be presenting our project Cultivation Chronicles, which was created in collaboration with my teammate, Kimberly Ware. Cultivation Chronicles pursues a relationship between landscapes and livelihoods through a system of ocean farming, pre-configuration, and water channeling strategies. In this project, we address the climate change crisis of flooding and sediment erosion. Our process and approach to tackling these issues is defined by centering people in labor, education, and water supply as a design response. At at the scale of the bay in terms of physical design, the interventions that line the Nantucket Harbor are outposts in Second Point of Berry Beach, as well as Nantucket Sound. The harbor scale designs are made for human activities, while the outposts are intended for seafood production. So in these animations, you see the formal strategies we propose for seafood production that also serves as infrastructure for climate resilience. Have domes hosting oysters that filter water and serve as wave attenuation structures in response to sediment loss on the Barrier Island. These oyster stumps, this grid, is a module for shallow conditions where people can wade into and sort of engage with the coastal landscape. And we have kelp farm outposts for seafood production characterized by multi-trophic aquaculture. Next slide, please. The boundaries of our site is defined by the future 9 feet sea level rise shoreline, which coincides with the current day Category 5 hurricane inundation zone in events of current emergencies. We introduced design strategies including ocean farming, seafood processing infrastructure, pure migration, water channels, open air markets. And we also propose that this future floodplain becomes a public commons. Next slide, please. In terms of programming design, Pier 1, Straight Wharf, remains touristic. Pier 2, which is Old South Wharf, is transformed into a seafood processing location and market. And Pier 3, Swain's Wharf, with its adjacent shallow waters, becomes primarily a school for aquaculture. Next slide. Thank you. The final form of Cultivation Chronicles is a field guide which takes the user through their arrival at the ferry terminal, the stories that unfold on each of the piers, and finally departure from Nantucket. Each chapter takes on the perspective of a tourist, ocean farmer, and aquaculture school student to walk through the lived experience of key design moments. Next slide, please. We first arrive at the ferry terminal, which is the locus of the migration of people. As Chris had mentioned already, historically, indigenous populations, POC whalers have arrived and departed from Nantucket. And today there's not only tourists and seasonal inhabitants who move through this terminal, but also seasonal workers from Latin America, the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, all over the US who come in search for summer jobs. Next slide, please. We then move to the first pier, which is defined by tourism recreation, with historic buildings being preserved and elevated. Next slide. Visitors and locals alike can take a boat out from Pier 1 to scuba dive in a kelp farm outpost in Nantucket Sound. So the recreational and farming landscape are not mutually exclusive. Next slide. The second pier is a fishery and open market that serves as processing commercial spaces for seafood. Next slide, please. In this phasing illustration, you can see as the sea level rises, the piers will be repurposed and pulled back further inland. We introduce fine grained ocean farming structures between the piers, like kelp floats and pilings for shellfish growth. We have water channels that ameliorate flooding, and we intend to build up Union Street as a flood barrier. Next slide. The third pier is primarily a space for ocean farming education, but also functions as a working waterfront where ocean farmers and students alike can tend to and process different seafoods at various facilities such as drying racks and kelp shacks. Next slide. The shallows south of the education pier is a field of community water gardens where students can learn to grow oysters along with the community. Seen here, as the sea levels rise, the stumps are pulled back and plugged into sleeve structures that anticipate the inland migration and changing compositions of coastal ecologies. Next slide. The oyster stumps in these shallows create new hydrodynamic conditions, which not only establish conditions for shellfish growth and critical sediment accumulation, but also shapes an intimate coastal landscape that people can intimately engage with and form an affinity. Last slide. All in all, Cultivation Chronicles calls into focus the role of landscape in the context of a maritime economy and livelihoods confronted by climate change. We hope to provoke fresh speculations by sharing these design landscapes as lived experience through this series of stories. Thank you so much. And I'll pass it on to Caleb.
Terrific. Thanks, Yvonne. Caleb, all yours.
Thanks. Thank you both. Hi, everybody. I'm Caleb. My partner Jenna and I worked on a project called Inhabiting Instabilities. So our approach to the project was sort of framed by the idea of inhabiting the unstable kind of condition of the shoreline. And this started with research on the multiple overlapping and shifting forms of land tenure that have defined sort of habitation on the island. So stretching back from the initial inhabitation of the island by indigenous peoples through European settlement and then into the present day. So this is an early map that we made kind of using archaeological artifacts of different indigenous groups that are uncovered in different sections of the island as a way of mapping the kind of persistence of naming traditions and as a kind of vestige of land tenure. And those are, I think, today more commonly remembered in place names, which are pretty prominent Native American place names all over the island. So you can go to the next slide here. So I guess looking a little more closely at our proposal, we wanted to take a look at this long stretch of the island on the North Shore, which is almost entirely residential. There are several public beaches and also a couple beach clubs and other kinds of recreational spaces. But we really wanted to step outside of the harbor, partly to home in on the idea of property and how existing models of private property are really bound up with questions of land, erosion, and coastal resilience. So we were mapping historic shorelines, a lot of the vulnerability to flooding. You can see these three kind of detailed sites at the bottom are the three that are circled on the top larger plan. And so we were looking at these sort of key points that are very vulnerable to flooding in addition to the kind of erosion of the coast. And we were also looking at the existing kind of structures that were trying to stabilize or protect the coast. So things like bulkheads and groins that are currently out there, which are very small and kind of scattered. So this diagram sort of the overarching concept. And we were really just trying to be critical of this sort of piecemeal approach of individual hardened edges, which sort of don't address the overall condition. And so our idea was to kind of use smaller elements that could be deployed at all across the stretch of shore. So this grid that's shown here represents wood piles. And we wanted to use sort of the idea of wood piles, clusters of stone, et cetera, as a way to kind of promote accretion of sediment and sand that would then eventually support the idea of inhabiting this unstable shoreline condition. Next slide. And so I know this is a little hard to see. We basically developed a catalog of different kinds of piles, wood piles, piers, walls, platforms, and also really importantly, rock assemblages in different clusters to kind of create this system on the shore. Next slide. And we were also really drawing inspiration from architectural traditions on Nantucket, including some of these raised dwellings and other precedents also from other kind of landscape projects, urban resilience, and also land art projects that use kind of wood piles in a sculptural way almost. Next slide. So these drawings give a bit of an overview in a cross section of how our project might be deployed. So this is kind of a typical cross section at the top here that shows how those different pieces of the catalog, the wood piles, piers, boardwalks, would be arranged to kind of allow for this dynamic kind of habitation. So you can see there are private houses next to like public recreation areas, and as well as underneath and around support through the kind of different rock clusters and other structures for ecological diversity, allowing kind of interconnected way of living for all different kinds of species. And so the diagram here is kind of a simple animation trying to show the process of this. So, as the wood piles would be sort of installed in the ground, and then as the shoreline erodes and shifts landward, those would become foundations for a new sort of more interconnected way of living within the instability. Next slide. And these concepts are kind of showing the explorations we did of different ways to arrange these rock piles and clusters. We started off with sort of simple rectilinear grids, but also tested out a lot of different other kinds of conditions and combinations, and tested these using hydrodynamic simulation to kind of find arrangements that would promote accretion of sediment, but also allow ecological diversity as well, and diversity of habitation. Next slide. And this plan shows just one close-up view of one of these iterations. So again, we're looking from the top down here and seeing the different piles that would be arranged in a sort of loose grid with existing housing shown inward on the right side of the plan. And so the concept that's being demonstrated here is just basically an example of how, as the shoreline recedes, existing houses would sort of effectively migrate out onto the sea on their new foundations. And the gray layers here are indicating the different levels of sediment accumulation that the wood piles and rock clusters would also promote. Next slide. And so here's a kind of another reiteration of that process shown in an isometric view. And this diagram is again indicating the kind of process of how these piles and this grid system would emerge over time as the shoreline erodes and sort of allow inhabitation of that dynamic space. And then these animations on the side are indicating some of the potential zoning and tax implications. So I guess without going too deeply into that line of thinking, we were sort of considering how a proposal like this could actually become feasible through compromise and concessions with property owners. So we could effectively flip existing models of ownership and habitation in a way that allows for meaningful and really dynamic public access as well to this shoreline, which is a really sort of fraught thing in Massachusetts and Nantucket in general, really getting that access of the public to the shoreline itself, especially on a stretch like this, which is almost entirely residential. Next slide. Yeah, this is the last slide. Yeah, and so just lastly here, again, just quickly showing some rendered views that we did to kind of illustrate the experience of inhabiting this unstable sort of dynamic shoreline through the use of this infrastructural system of wood piles, boardwalks, et cetera, to kind of create an interconnected habitat for people, for the public, for private homeowners, in addition to all other kinds of species as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Caleb. You can see how the students were really wrestling. Sorry, there's a helicopter going overhead, perfect timing. Really wrestling with some of the public-private issues as well as some of the bigger environmental challenges here. So I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, so if I could just jump in and just remind everybody who watched that, which I hope was as inspiring to all of you as it was to me. It was very important for us at Remain to not tether the students to the ins and outs of the life that we lead here on Nantucket. That includes the HDC, the CONCOM, and restrictions that we currently have to live with through ZBA and stuff like that. We wanted the students to take inspiration from what the island has looked like in the past to reimagine something for the future without worrying too much about our current details. Let's just call them details. And I think the beauty of that is that we've opened up a lens that is really inclusive and imaginative and incredibly beautiful. But almost more important than that, it reflects, makes us all reflect on the fact that Nantucket has been adaptable since the beginning of time. The downtown, the landscape that we know and love right now is not the same landscape, not the same built environment that existed even 10 years ago, and let alone 100 years ago. So it's foolish to think that something would be exactly the same going into the future. And so for that reason, I really love the fact that the students' designs opened us up to possibility and reminded us that we've always been adaptable and resilient and imaginative, all the while being tied to industry and commerce and tourism and everything else that is true now and will be true in the future. So with that sort of final wrapping up comment, I wondered if there was time for any questions, Mary. Do you know if there's been any typed questions for us?
Don't see anything yet.
Okay.
I think everybody's letting it all sink in. But if people do have questions, that would be great. I too really appreciate that the students were not tethered to, some of our more stringent policies and guidelines. I think it's really exciting to be able to stretch your imagination and to think about what could be possible. I think that's where we are in all elements of the discussions that we've been having today, whether it's solar or taking apart a building and reusing as much of the material as possible, as opposed to mechanical demolition. Just because something is the way that we've been doing things for years or even decades, doesn't mean that that's the way things have to move going forward. It's a lesson we've all learned in the last 18 months. I have a question, which is, did the experience of coming to Nantucket after you had been off island and then you arrived on island, do you feel like you would have changed any of your designs, or does that inform your thinking differently, actually being here and feeling it, smelling it, tasting it?
I learned more probably in 15 minutes of walking around than, like, nothing beats the ground truth ever. And we're fortunate, to have Google Maps and all these other resources, but immediately I thought of so much I would do different, honestly. So, alas.
Alex, you were here, right? What did you think?
Yeah, it was a big question of scale for me, I think, and also just even talking with some of the residents there for the brief time that we had during the exhibition was especially fruitful for me, designing like a neighborhood that's primarily residential. So getting that kind of feedback is really important.
Yeah. Yeah, it was originally, of course, when we thought of this project, we imagined that you'd all be able to see it before, but COVID meant that the students couldn't come until after they had submitted their designs. And, I think Mary, I asked a lot of the students that very question that when they were all here in June, and it was a little bit of a mixed bag. I think everybody spoke to what you're saying, Alex, that the study area was so much smaller than they had imagined it being. They had built it up in their minds to be a much bigger place than it actually was. So that, I think, was a common theme. But other students, I think, felt like working in a vacuum allowed them, as I said, to be really, really imaginative. And so I think there were advantages to both. Sara, did you have that feedback from your students too?
Yeah, the ones that came, actually, I mean, again, just talking to just that little bit of connection, which was so remote, but talking to the residents, I know, as Alex mentioned, that was actually a really important pivot for his project, and to see their pictures from around the island as well that were outside of the study area. I think that was it's actually like a really key turning point for lots of people in the class. But yeah, our 4 students that came, they all said the same thing. I think I saw you guys like a half hour after you got off the ferry and met you at the warehouse, and everybody said, that's so much different than we thought. It was my first time to Nantucket too. I moved to Massachusetts about 3 years ago. So it was also transformational for me as well.
Yeah. And Caleb and Yvonne, you haven't been here yet, have you?
We didn't make it. Yeah, unfortunately. The most island experience I got was watching recordings of the sort of planning board and zoning board meetings, which was definitely a real taste of life, I think. But yeah, no, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say you're an honorary islander. That's really above and beyond. But I think, right, the idea of, the pandemic has pushed so many of these meetings online, and really that's a great way to get a taste of what a community is like and what are the values that the community has. And what is going to change. And I think that's what everybody is scared of, excited to see. So much of the work that we do is all about, I just keep saying it over and over, but managing change. Yeah. So we're so thankful to all of you for your time today and for sharing your expertise. And for anybody who's on the call who hasn't had a chance, if you go down to Straight Wharf to the Thomas Macy warehouse at 12 Straight Wharf on the second floor, you can see some of these posters more. This was really great to get a chance to hear from these two teams to drill down a little bit deeper, but all of the other colleges and universities presentations are up down there at the Thomas Macy warehouse. And Cecil, you have an event coming up at the warehouse, right?
Yes. September. Yes. I don't know if Claire's on, can remind me the date. I think it's the 27th.
I think it's the 27th.
27th, yeah. So that is, let's see. Oh, I don't have it handy, but please go to our website.
I do. I got an email.
It's with. So I know it's with Jen Carberg and Sara from the Linda Loring and Emily. Oh, there she is. Thank you, Claire. She's given us information in the chat, so please have a look. And Emily Molden from the Land Council, and they were all three advisors to the students, and I had a front row seat to all of the work that they were doing. But more than that, they are dealing with resilient issues in their own organizations, and so they're going to share a little bit of their perspective on the work at hand in building a more resilient landscape on Nantucket. So there, thank you, Claire. Coffee, climate, and conversation, resilience in landscapes. There you go, on the 27th. Okay. So I guess the final thing I just want to say about the exhibition is that we've had probably close to 1,500 visitors in there already. So we've had a really good number of people come through. And a lot of them come in and point to their property. They're, people who live in Brent Point or in town. Maybe they work in town and they're pointing out their exact location. And that is so compelling for this community to be able to put themselves squarely in the middle of some of your designs. And that there's nothing more powerful than that. And I think the opportunity for people to actually reimagine how they're going to interact with their environment, their properties, their landscapes, their houses by looking at your designs has been really, really powerful. And it truly at the heart of why we wanted to host this project right from the start, because we do want to inspire people to think about living with water in innovative and beautiful ways. So on behalf of the community and everybody who's seen the exhibition and everyone who's been part of it, thank you to the students and to the faculty for doing just a marvelous job of reimagining our harbor front.
Yeah, thank you, Cecil and Romaine, and thank you for everyone for your presentations today. And before we wrap up, I just want to thank all of the speakers today and yesterday, all the panelists, all the attendees, and everyone who asked a question, everyone who is going to be watching the videos later. I know we've got a lot of emails from folks saying they weren't able to join us live, but they're looking forward to really digging in and watching these presentations on their own time. We'll be sending out the presentations to everyone who attended the conference or registered for the conference and all the speakers. So once that's done, I hope you'll be able to forward these on to friends you think would benefit from hearing these conversations. We're really looking forward to keeping some of these conversations going. I think these are really important and difficult topics to tackle and to balance, and it requires a lot of everybody thinking about it I was going to say all the time, but I guess we do need to take a break from thinking about this from time to time, most of the time anyway. We're so appreciative of all your support of this conference, Rescuing History, Nantucket in Response to Rising Seas, and to Remain Nantucket for their foundational support of this event and other conferences that we've held. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day and have a lovely weekend. And we'll talk to you later.